I've been responding to Richard Dawkins' critique of Aquinas' arguments for God's existence, and we've been focusing on the first way, the argument from motion. In the first presentation, I gave a sketch of how the argument works. In the second presentation, I responded to the first several arguments, or the first couple of arguments that Dawkins makes by way of critique of Aquinas' argument. What I'd like to do in this presentation is finish the look at Dawkins' criticisms of Aquinas' argument as a way of illustrating, I think, that the arguments that Dawkins makes, or the response that Dawkins makes, is not a persuasive one. Immediately after presenting his concerns about contradictions between the attributes of God, which was the last topic that I mentioned in the prior presentation, he goes on to say, to return to the infinite regress and the futility of invoking God to terminate it, which I've argued is not a futile move. In fact, it's a necessary move based on the nature of motion alongside of the impossibility of an infinite regress of dependent causal relationships. He goes on to say it is more parsimonious to conjure up, say, a Big Bang singularity or some other physical concept as yet unknown. In other words, all things being equal, it is more simple and therefore more persuasive to conjure up some type of other explanation, a physical explanation of things, rather than to propose the existence of a God that transcends the physical world. That is the ultimate reason for the physical world. Of course, as one who accepts the validity of Aquinas' argument here, this is not a very persuasive thing. Aquinas would simply respond and say that a Big Bang singularity or a physical cause as yet unknown is still not going to be a sufficient explanation, because a physical cause, as Aquinas understands matter, is going to be a principle of pliability, of change, of dependence, of motion, and therefore it's still not going to ultimately answer or satisfy our search for an explanation. But in any case, this statement, I think, reveals Dawkins' fundamental worldview commitment here to materialism or some kind of physicalism, that the only thing that exists is matter, and therefore any proposed explanation that transcends the material world is an unacceptable explanation. I don't think that is a sound philosophical position, but it is certainly a commitment and an assumption that Dawkins brings with him to the discussion of this subject. He then goes on to offer a rather bizarre illustration to try to address the infinite regress problem. And to my mind, and you can read it for yourself, it's found on page 102 of Dawkins' book, to my mind this whole paragraph functions more like a red herring. You know, in informal fallacies and logic, a red herring is, you know, like a smelly fish. You put it in front of people to distract their attention from the real issue. And what he does here is he offers some observations about, you know, cutting things down to their smallest, most irreducible point, which he says would be like some atomic structure. So if I take a piece of gold and I cut it down as far as I can cut it, I will get to a terminating point of the gold. In other words, there's a point at which the gold cannot be reduced any further without ceasing to be gold. And so then he asks, well, in the case of God, he says, you know, there's, for example, he says there toward the end of his statement, he says, if you cut gold any further than the level of a single atom, whatever else you get is not gold. The atom provides a natural terminator, and it is by no means clear that God provides a natural terminator to the regresses of Aquinas. That's putting it mildly, and so on. So it's a little confusing what exactly his purpose is here in talking about cutting things down to their smallest pieces. Is he suggesting here that whenever we talk about God, that's the kind of argument we're making, is that you cut down causes all the way down to their most fundamental level, and there you have God? And what Dawkins is saying is that he doesn't think that God is necessary in order to get a fundamental natural cause of things. Perhaps that's the point, is that when you're dealing with natural things, all you need is a fundamental natural explanation, and we don't need to get to God. That, of course, I think misses entirely Aquinas' point that he's making, which is that what we need is an explanation of motion. In Dawkins' response here, he doesn't really even take seriously the notion of motion. What he's doing here is just focusing on the idea of how far can you cut something down and what kind of causal explanation do you need. Well, what Aquinas is arguing is that you need an unmoved mover, or you need a supreme, ultimate explanation of everything, which would end up having very different attributes or qualities than changing things or things undergoing motion. And it doesn't seem to me that Dawkins ever, in the whole response that he makes here, ever seriously treats what Aquinas means by motion. Now let me conclude this sort of response to Dawkins' criticisms of Aquinas' first three arguments. Let me just conclude with a few more reflections on the impossibility of an infinite regress. And the way I want to do that is maybe in a reverse way, by referring to an ancient Greek philosopher by the name of Zeno. Zeno is famous for a series of paradoxes that he created that were designed to show that motion or change in the world is an illusion. I want you to imagine movement between any 2 points. Let's say between you and the computer screen in front of you, or the iPad screen in front of you. Let's say that you're going to move toward the screen. You're going to move your hand to the screen right now and pick it up. Pick up the iPad, or maybe pick up the monitor screen of the computer in front of you. What Zeno would say is, between those 2 points, the point at which your hand now is and the point of the computer screen, draw a line between those 2 points. Let's say where your hand is now, that's point A, and the computer screen is point B. In order for your hand to move to point B, to the computer screen, it has to cross over that line that separates those 2 points. Then Zeno asks the question, or makes the statement, that in order to get from point A to point B, you must cross a halfway point between A and B. That makes sense. You've got to get halfway before you can get all the way there. All right, if you have to get halfway, then you also have to get halfway to the halfway point. And to get halfway to the halfway point, you have to get to another halfway point, and another, and another. And then he asks the question, how many times can I divide the line between me, or my hand, and the computer screen? And the answer, of course, that any basic geometry student would give is that you can divide the line to infinity. So the conclusion seems to be that there's an infinite number of points between me and the computer screen. If there's an infinite number of points between me and the computer screen, then, Zeno argues, it's really impossible logically for my hand to move over an infinity of points in a finite amount of time. I can't do it. You cannot move over an infinity in finite time. The conclusion then is that motion must be an illusion, because it's illogical to think that I can pass over infinities every time I move, or every time I move my hand, or every time I go from point A to point B, I'm passing over an infinite number of points. Now, the obvious response to that will be, well, wait a minute, I know I'm moving all the time. I've just moved my hand to the computer screen, or I just walked across the room. Zeno would not be impressed. Zeno would say, well, of course, that's what your senses tell you, but your senses are deceiving you. The reality is, you never move. In other words, everything you're experiencing right now is just a grand dream of some sort, or it's just part of the illusion, for some reason, generated by an unchanging eternal reality. Now, you can ask all the questions that you want, in your mind, and I'm sure you've got a lot of good ones in your mind. But the conundrum here is, how do we get the math or the geometry of an infinite number of points between any 2 points? How do we get the math to correspond to reality? How do I get up and walk to the door if there's an infinite number of points between me and the door? Now, I think the answer is kind of obvious. The answer is that even though mathematically and abstractly there's an infinite number of points between me and the door, in the sense of abstracting away from the real space between me and the door, there is mathematically an indivisible number of points on any given line. There can't be a real infinite of finite things between any 2 locations. And if there is a real infinite, you could never pass over them. So, for example, if I say there's an infinite number of desks or an infinite number of chairs between my door, my front door, and my back door, if there truly were an infinite number of desks between my front and back door, I could never get from the front door to the back door, because you can't pass over a true infinite of real things in space and in time. The problem is that we're mixing up in the illustration or in the argument Zeno was mixing the abstract world of geometry with the real material world of extended things and finite things in space and time. Now, if my critique is right, and if what I've suggested to you is right, then a real infinite of things, infinity of things, in the sensory changing world of our experience is not possible. No real series of infinite series of things is possible. Certainly not an infinite number of things traversed in a finite amount of time. But if right here and now, in order for me to say what I'm saying to you, an infinite number of preconditions have to be satisfied right now in order for me to say these words, then I certainly could not get to this moment, no more than in Zeno's world I could get to the door if there's a true infinity of things that separate me from the door. If you follow everything that I've said, I think that you will see the power of the argument here, that right here and now there cannot be an infinite number of things depending on other things that are allowing this moment to be real. If it's a finite number of things, then there must be an ultimate or first grounding for everything. And if there is a first grounding of everything, it must be eternal. That is, it has no origin, no beginning, unless it comes from nothing, and nothing is no explanation of anything. So if nothing cannot be the explanation of things, there must be a first, there must be an eternal, there must be an infinite, because it's not bounded or restricted by anything other than itself. It must be self-existent, it must be uncaused, and there are many other things that we can say about this first cause simply by reflecting on it. And if you look at Aquinas' Summa Theology and just flip through the pages, you'll see there are a lot of interesting things that can be deduced from the argument that I just presented. And Dawkins, to my mind, does nothing to undermine the strength of the argument at all. If anything, it's a profound misunderstanding of the argument, and the argument in relationship to what Dawkins has argued here stands very strong. One final point about Dawkins is that if you look at the index, if you look at the footnotes, you will see very clearly that Dawkins has not done his homework on St. Thomas. St. Thomas, there's lots of scholarship, there's lots of articles, there's lots of full-length books out there that discuss these arguments, and I see no evidence that Dawkins has taken the time to seriously understand and reflect on these arguments to truly understand them. And that's reflected in the fact that his critique of them is among the most surface, unhelpful, and weak responses to Aquinas that I've read.